The story of Florence Ebersole Smith Finch is one of civilian defiance against the Japanese Empire. It does not begin with the crackle of a radio or the shudder of a bomb. It begins in the humid, exploitative atmosphere of the American colonial Philippines. This environment first broke her spirit, but then forged her resilience. Florence's father, Charles Ebersole, arrived in Manila Bay in 1899. He was a young medic, one of thousands of Americans seizing opportunity after the Spanish-American War. Manila immediately stripped him of his boyhood illusions of glory and high adventure. He saw the wrecked Spanish fleet and the horrors of the subsequent Philippine-American War. Men were dying daily from typhoid and malaria in the overflowing hospitals. Yet Ebersole stayed in the Philippines. He grew to love the country for its unhurried atmosphere and warmth. With an almost reptilian cold-bloodedness, he acquired a large plantation. This property became his own private treasure island. The plantation was heavy with the intoxicating scent of bananas, coconuts, and citrus. It was a stark contrast to the pine-paneled library he built inside his home. This library was a sanctuary of American intellectualism, transplanted onto the tropics. In 1907, Ebersole took Maria Hermoso as his common-law wife. Their daughter, Loring May Ebersole, was born in 1915. For Loring, the plantation was anything but paradise. Her childhood was a cataclysm defined by abandonment and fear. When Charlie left Maria for her half-sister in 1917, Maria descended into a devastating grief. This grief quickly curdled into a sullen rage. The abuse Loring and her siblings endured was systematic and horrifying. Maria would force the children to kneel in beds of coarse salt. She would strike them viciously with a long bamboo pole. Loring became traumatized and emotionally shut down. She found her only solace in the intellectual sanctuary of her father's library, escaping through books. The escape became permanent in 1923. She was sent to Manila to attend Union Church Hall, a massive stone fortress. There, the superintendent insisted on renaming her Florence. The name meant blooming flower, Florencia, and offered a symbolic break from her traumatic past. Yet, even in the privileged American enclave of Manila, Florence's mixed heritage subjected her to cruel prejudice. Some parishioners cruelly referred to the Mestiza girls as tar babies. While Florence thrived academically, her father's life spiraled. Charlie Ebersole died from tuberculosis at St. Luke's Hospital in 1928. His final writings confessed his profound weakness. He wrote that thinking of the kids was the only thing that had made him struggle to continue living. The subsequent legal battle over his estate became a fight for survival and recognition. This struggle was the crucible that forged the self-reliant character Florence would later rely upon. It solidified her financial independence. This marked her transition from a victim of colonial circumstance to an accomplished young woman. She was now determined to control her own future. In 1935, Florence was hired as a secretary at the prestigious Army-Navy YMCA. It was a four-story institution spanning two city blocks. Working for the American expatriate elite, she maintained a reputation as a goody two-shoes, but the world around her was darkening rapidly. By 1937, as Japan rampaged across China, Florence heard first-hand reports of atrocities. She chronicled the growing global crisis in her mind. She wondered why the world powers failed to intervene to prevent the terrible toll of bloodshed. The palpable tension in Manila soon brought two important men into her orbit. Karl Engelhardt, the lean and astute deputy head of U.S. Army intelligence, arrived in 1940. He was already fluent in Japanese and acutely aware of the militarist threat. Then came Chief Petty Officer Charles E. Smith, a strapping blue-eyed sailor transferred to naval intelligence. Smith, who was nicknamed Bing for his resemblance to Bing Crosby, initiated a relationship with Florence at the YMCA front desk. He explained the nomadic nature of a sailor's life. He said sailors were like turtles whose shells carried them all over the world. Florence, resilient from her fractured childhood, replied with quiet acceptance. She supposed that turtles needed more time for everything, and she would give it to him. Despite Karl Engelhardt's concerns for her reputation, the courtship intensified. It culminated in a marriage where Florence wore a simple white linen dress. Their personal lives quickly converged with their professional duties inside the ancient Spanish walls of Fort Santiago. Florence accepted a prestigious role as the administrative secretary for Army intelligence. This placed her directly at the heart of pre-war preparations. The global political landscape was darkening toward the inevitable brutal conflict. The resilience forged in her traumatic colonial past would soon be tested. The disaster that unfolded in the Philippines on December 8, 1941, was colossal. It was not simply a consequence of Japanese skill. It was a failure of American command and an arrogance of leadership that proved fatal. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to command with a mandate to consolidate power. He stacked his staff with loyalists, even those he privately scorned. He appointed Charles Willoughby, a man he derided as his pet fascist, as his intelligence chief. Willoughby established a system that actively stifled accurate, unorthodox information. This sidelined Karl Engelhardt, the deputy head of G2 who spoke Japanese and understood the militarist threat. Engelhardt's late November reports, detailing unusual Japanese air activity, were ignored. Willoughby demanded all intelligence be funneled solely through his office. This bureaucratic choke point ensured that critical warning signs were missed. This dysfunctional command structure resulted in a catastrophic delay on the morning of the attack. At 5:30 a.m., MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Richard Sutherland, received the cable from Washington. It confirmed the attack on Pearl Harbor and ordered the execution of the Defensive War Plan, Rainbow 5. MacArthur's headquarters rigidly adhered to the doctrine not to launch offensive attacks until fired upon. Air Force Commander Louis Breton was desperate to save his assets. He attempted repeatedly to get approval for preemptive strikes against Japanese staging bases on Formosa. 100 troop transports sat visible in the harbor there. The B-17 bombers were operational, but they were held back. They circled aimlessly for hours. The 4-hour lapse between the Pearl Harbor news and decisive action remains one of the greatest command failures of the war. Critics argued the launch, finally scheduled for the early evening, was prioritized around MacArthur's personal schedule. This bureaucratic inertia bought exactly the time the Japanese needed. At 10:30 a.m., the B-17s were recalled to Clark Field to refuel and rearm. The radar station at Iba Field spotted incoming aircraft at 11:30 a.m., yet the alert was somehow misplaced or ignored at Clark. When the Mitsubishi bombers and Zero fighters arrived at 12:30 p.m., they found their targets waiting. The bulk of the U.S. Far East Air Force was lined up on the ground. The resulting annihilation left 230 men killed or wounded at Clark Field. Nearly 50% of American personnel were killed or wounded at Iba Field. A massive funnel of greasy smoke rose high above the field, visible from Manila. It was a physical manifestation of the fact that the Philippines were now defenseless. In the face of this strategic collapse, the defense became a desperate, doomed effort. Admiral Thomas Hart made the painful but pragmatic decision to withdraw his surface warships. He would not allow his fleet to be decimated, like the bombers at Clark Field. The naval evacuation ensured the Philippines were cut off and isolated without hope of immediate relief. General MacArthur abandoned his initial aggressive defense orders. He implemented War Plan Orange, a 16-year-old contingency plan. This plan called for a fallback to the Baton Peninsula. As the military retreat began, chaos engulfed Manila. Looting broke out immediately. The intelligence staff, including Karl Engelhardt, was ordered to evacuate. Chief Petty Officer Bing Smith was also ordered out. Florence spent Christmas Eve 1941 burning top-secret military files. The smoke stung her eyes. As Bing packed, he gave her practical instructions for survival. He knew he was leaving her in the path of the enemy. "I will come back to you, Florencia," he promised. He joined Karl and other officers aboard an intercoastal steamer. Their departure was hastened by thunderous explosions as fuel tank facilities were blown up. MacArthur then declared Manila an open city to spare it destruction. He simultaneously issued a radio address that included the defiant promise, "I shall return." The evacuation centered on Baton and Corregidor. The island fortress of Corregidor resembled an immense tadpole swimming 2 miles from the peninsula. Karl Engelhardt was tasked with surveying the defensive minefields around Corregidor, with often obsolete equipment. The command headquarters was set up in the damp, bomb-proof Malinta Tunnel. While military convoys choked the roads leading north to Bataan, the civilian population of Manila was left behind. They were left alone to face the occupation. When the Japanese advance elements entered the city on January 2, 1942, Florence watched. The seemingly endless procession filled Taft Avenue. Mechanized tanks thundered past, followed by trucks and soldiers riding bicycles. The red-balled Japanese flag, starkly reminiscent of a fried egg, was everywhere. It marked the finality of the American defeat. From the relative safety of Corregidor, Karl Engelhardt surveyed the harbor's empty anchorage. He watched wave after wave of Japanese bombers attack the fortress. The truth was inescapable for the defenders and the civilians left behind. The Philippines were definitively cut off and isolated. The occupation of Manila brought the brutal reality of defeat into sharp focus. Nowhere was that reality more acute than inside the barbed wire of Cabanatuan Prison Camp No. 1. For Lieutenant Colonel Karl Engelhardt and thousands of prisoners, existence was a constant battle. They fought the psychological disintegration caused by starvation, disease, and casual cruelty. The camp was a world where men were reduced to a primal struggle for survival. Karl had dropped 30 pounds, and his ankles were permanently swollen from edema. He described terrifying episodes of derealization. He would wake up in the stifling dark, utterly unsure of his identity or location. The sounds of the camp were the sounds of suffering. There were the hacking coughs of the dying. There was the rhythmic scraping of shovels, digging new mass graves. There was the relentless, maddening drone of flies. Escape was suicide, but the internal resistance of the mind was essential. Karl found a crucial, if precarious, advantage in his fluency in Japanese. Serving as an interpreter was high risk. One mistake could bring the wrath of a samurai sword, yet it granted him limited influence. He used this leverage to mitigate random beatings and protect his fellow prisoners. During one tense interrogation, Japanese officers pressed Karl about the presence of Jewish POWs. They were likely under pressure from their German allies. Karl responded with calm, high-stakes defiance. He argued in their own language that there were no Jews in the American armed forces, only Americans. The answer, delivered with appropriate respect, satisfied the officers and ended the inquiry. This act spared countless men from further, targeted persecution. Meanwhile, back in Manila, Florence Ebersole Smith faced her own crisis of survival. Her savings were nearly gone, and the need to feed her family was paramount. She secured a job as a bookkeeper at the Philippine Liquid Fuel Distribution Union. The work was tedious, involving the cataloguing of vouchers and the processing of fuel ration coupons. These coupons were the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine. Florence quickly realized the vulnerability of the system. The stamped coupon was the sole medium of exchange. Customers were not required to show identification. The moral imperative to act came through Angelita Alvarez Sobral. Angelita, her former colleague in Army intelligence, was risking her life on mercy missions. She painted a visceral picture of the death camps, where men were dying by the hundreds. Florence immediately used her connections to smuggle money to Karl. This clandestine aid was a lifeline, allowing Karl and others to buy vital food and medicine. It was a temporary reprieve from the death sentence of starvation. Karl's coded message back to Manila was clear. "Tell your friends I approve," he wrote. This was the green light for Florence to escalate her resistance. The desperation reached a peak in September 1942. A diphtheria epidemic swept through Cabanatuan. The hospital ward became a kennel full of barking dogs as men struggled to breathe. The Manila Underground, aided by Florence's network, frantically smuggled in the life-saving antitoxin. Karl focused on maintaining the mental fortitude of those still functioning. Using a penknife, he carved 2 sets of chessmen from a 4-foot strip of wood. This simple act of ingenuity provided a crucial distraction. It was a symbolic return to reasoned thought amidst the chaos. Karl also used his rapport with Japanese personnel, particularly Lieutenant Hayoshi. He procured parts for a shortwave radio. He believed the lure of genuine war news outweighed the risk of execution. The radio, successfully activated, provided a critical, secret morale boost. It confirmed to the prisoners that the Allied war machine was still moving. Karl also secured an electric pump for the farm detail using his influence. This relieved hundreds of men of the grueling manual labor of carrying water all day. With the aid network established, Florence planned her most ambitious act of sabotage. Her new associate was Ricardo de Castro. The plan was to divert fuel. Ricardo, harboring deep resentment toward the occupation, agreed to organize the distribution to the guerrillas. The core of the plan was simple. Florence would smuggle blank coupons from the storeroom. She would imprint them with the official union stamp. Then she would alter the weekly tallies in the ledger to mask the theft. Their test run was a moment of profound tension. They successfully diverted 100 gallons of fuel that first week. Florence was astonished by the ease of the infiltration. The Japanese, arrogant in their assumption of control, had built a vulnerable bureaucracy. This quiet, continuous theft was the engine of the resistance. It began at 100 gallons, soon escalating to 200 gallons weekly. It sustained the Filipino underground, purchased medicine, and kept the American powers alive. Florence profoundly challenged the myth of absolute Japanese authority in the occupied Philippines. The unassuming mestiza clerk had successfully exploited the empire's reliance on paper and process. She had turned their own system against them. In the summer and autumn of 1944, the resistance network suffered under the Kempei's iron fist. The Japanese military police were escalating their repression. They turned their attention from the POW camps to the civilian underground. The arrests were swift and devastating. In June, the Kempei captured General Vicente Lim, a famous Filipino soldier. They seized Josefa Escoda, the beacon of goodness, who had organized food kitchens, and her husband, Tony Escoda. The Escodas had risked everything to funnel Florence's fuel profits to the dying men at Cabanatuan. Their capture was a profound blow, signaling that the network was penetrated. The Kempei's methods were designed not just to extract information, but to annihilate the human spirit. At Cabanatuan, Colonel Carl Engelhardt watched Chaplain Fred Oliver suffer a broken neck during the beatings. The constant, gnawing fear of discovery left Florence listless and detached. When the Kempei finally discovered the fuel diversions in September 1944, they confiscated her home. Though she wept over the loss of her physical sanctuary, she recognized a profound sense of liberation. The forced abandonment freed her from the constant tension of maintaining a double life. But the reprieve was short-lived. On October 16, 1944, the Kempei came for Florence. She was taken to the airport studio, repurposed as the interrogation headquarters. Survivors described this place as a pit of hell. Inside, the silence was broken only by the random, howling shrieks of tortured men and women. The interrogation was relentless. Florence endured severe beatings that loosened her teeth and left her jaw throbbing. She was subjected to waterboarding and electrical torture. The current sent hot shooting pains through her body, leaving her fingers bruised and charred black. Florence fought the degradation, clinging to a single vital objective. She had to protect the network. She strategically confessed only to lesser, fabricated charges. She absorbed the punishment, so the true extent of the fuel diversion and her collaborators would remain hidden. As Florence endured the terror of her cell, a seismic shift was occurring hundreds of miles away. On October 20, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore on Leyte. His massive armada included 7,000 soldiers. He had fulfilled his long-ago promise. I have returned. The campaign to liberate the Philippines had begun. The Japanese response was instantaneous and chilling. It was the systematic relocation of all Allied prisoners to Japan. This policy triggered the most horrific chapter of the transport system, the voyages of the Hell ships. Carl Engelhardt walked through the deserted Cabanatuan camp, now a dusty ghost town. He and 1,750 officers and enlisted men were marched to a railroad siding. They were packed tightly into cattle cars for transport to Manila. They were bound for the sea, but their destination was death. On October 24, 1944, the unmarked prisoner transport Arisan Maru sailed from Manila Bay. It was packed with 1,750 American POWs below deck. The ship was not flying the white flag designated by the Geneva Convention. An American submarine spotted the Japanese convoy and fired its torpedoes. Unaware of the human cargo within, the submarine struck the Arisan Maru. The ship began to sink rapidly. Men were trapped below deck in the dark, suffocating holds. The Japanese crew abandoned the sinking ship. offering no aid to the prisoners. The loss was total. Of the 1,750 men loaded aboard, only 9 managed to escape and reach shore. Only 5 of those 9 survived the war. The rest perished, swallowed by the sea, just as their liberation was beginning. The loss of the Arasan Maru was a silent, massive death. It starkly illustrated the systematic brutality of the Japanese transport system. The Japanese continued the policy, herding the next group of prisoners toward the docks. Karl Engelhardt was among them, destined for the next vessel in the murderous convoy, the Oryoku Maru. The final stage of the liberation of Manila was not a triumphant parade. It was a desperate house-to-house slaughter. MacArthur's forces had freed the prisoners at Cabanatuan and the internees at Santo Tomas, but the heart of the city remained a battlefield. Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi fanatically defied orders to withdraw. He turned Manila into a fortress designed for annihilation. 1 million Filipino civilians were trapped in this crucible. The battle devolved into brutal urban warfare, fought with flamethrowers and high explosives. The Pearl of the Orient was reduced to a landscape of pulverized concrete. The Japanese naval forces unleashed a wave of massacres. These atrocities were designed not for military gain, but for pure terror and vengeance. 400 civilians were rounded up and killed near St. Paul's College. 500 civilians were burned alive inside the Manila German Club. The pervasive stench of death was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of decomposing corpses lay under the pitiless sun. Amidst this carnage, the survivors of the Women's Correctional Institution were liberated. Florence Ebersole Smith was freed on February 10, 1945. Reduced to skin and bones, Florence was carried out by an American soldier. The physical toll of her 3.5-year ordeal was undeniable. The campus of Santo Tomas University served as a fragile oasis for recovery. Here, amidst the distant crump of artillery, Florence began to heal. She listened to an orchestra play George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. She found solace in the art that had been suppressed for years. On April 9th, Florence boarded the USS Admiral E.W. Ebeler, a Coast Guard transport ship. The voyage provided rapid, restorative change. The sea, air, plentiful food, and the simple act of walking the decks quickly restored her physical health. The war's conclusion arrived with sudden horrifying finality. While Florence was crossing the Pacific, rumors circulated of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The formal surrender was announced on August 14, 1945. This brought Florence an immense emotional release. The news reached the surviving prisoners of war weeks later. Karl Engelhardt had miraculously survived the hell ships and the freezing Japanese camps. He had recently faced a near execution in Incheon prison camp. He was saved only by a desperate lie, he told the camp commander. Then, on September 8, 1945, the commandant gathered the gaunt, physically spent men. He announced that the war was over and they were no longer prisoners of war. Of the 1,620 men who had boarded the Oryoku Maru with Karl, only 113 survived the war. Florence was driven by her desire to honor the sacrifice of her decorated husband, Bing. She sought purpose in the military. She was sworn into the U.S. Coast Guard SPARS in June 1945. Her 6-week boot camp provided the discipline and camaraderie she needed to transition back to life. Karl Engelhardt returned to the United States, visibly weak but mentally sharp. He was relentless in his pursuit of justice and recognition. His mission was unwavering. He was determined to ensure Florence's heroism was officially recorded. He believed her actions had saved his life and the lives of countless others. Karl suspected his old nemesis, Charles Willoughby, had destroyed crucial intelligence reports to cover up the 1941 command failures. Following their emotional reunion in Washington, D.C. in November 1945, Karl submitted her nomination. He confirmed the devastating loss of their resistance network to Florence. On November 7, 1947, Florence Ebersole Smith Finch received the Medal of Freedom. It was awarded for meritorious service from June 1942 to February 1945. It was a formal acknowledgement of her extraordinary courage as a civilian resistance operative. Yet, Florence quietly insisted that her contributions were trivial compared to those who had given their lives. She carried the weight of the war silently, unwilling to broadcast the horrors she had endured. The profound significance of Florence's quiet heroism would only fully emerge decades later. Karl Engelhardt passed away in 1995. That same year, the U.S. Coast Guard announced it would dedicate its Pacific headquarters building in Honolulu in her honor. The dedication ceremony in June 1995 finally broke Florence's long-held silence. It cemented her legacy as an indomitable heroine, whose resilience and courage contributed directly to saving lives. She passed away peacefully in 2016 at the age of 100. In her final moments, Florence referenced the painful childhood she had spent a lifetime escaping. Her last words were a whisper of her original identity. "I remember my mother calling me Loring," she said. "You know my real name is Loring May Ebersol." Florence was buried with full military honors in the spring, a season of rebirth. Her burial confirmed that the heroism she displayed was the defining characteristic of her long, resilient life.